Hello, my name is Mordred Viking and I'd like to welcome you to this tutorial of the naval mechanics in Hearts of Iron 4, which were introduced with Man the Guns. First of all, we're going to talk about the different ships and their roles in the game. We're going to talk about the various orders which you can give to your fleets and your task forces, and what exactly they do and how they interact with each other. We're going to talk about the Admirals, how to upgrade them and who to assign to which orders. And then finally, we will touch on the different doctrines which are available. So let's talk about the different types of ships which are available. First of all, we've got the screens. Screens are destroyers and light cruisers. Their role is usually reconnaissance, it's anti-submarine warfare, it's screening the bigger ships, it's escorting your convoys and things like that, and then also potentially mine laying as well. After that, we have the capital ships. These are the big boys of the ocean. They are the heavy cruisers, battle cruisers, and battleships, and their job is to go toe-to-toe with enemy shipping, and potentially, in the case of heavy cruisers and battle cruisers, to sink enemy screens. Then we've also got carriers. That's these guys up here. They are the ones who obviously carry the aircraft in a naval task force. We have submarines. Their job is simply harassment. They are tasked with trying to sink enemy convoys and just disrupt shipping, and possibly hitting the unprotected capital ships if you come across any. And then finally, we've got the convoys. Their job is, of course, to transport goods through trade and also transporting soldiers. But how exactly do these different ships and their roles actually work in the game? Well, that's where the fleets, task forces, and orders come in. At the high level, you have different fleets. So for example, here we have the submarine fleet. The submarine fleet is composed of different task forces. As we can see here, the submarine fleet has 4 different task forces, and then each of the task forces has 10 submarines in it. So we have one fleet, 4 task forces, then each task force has 10 ships, as we can see listed over here. Each fleet can have one admiral. These admirals should be selected depending on their skills and the role that they will be taking. So for the submarine fleet, we probably want to have somebody with the Sea Wolf trait. Unfortunately, the United Kingdom doesn't actually start with one, so we want to have somebody who can act in a similar capacity. In the past, I've used John Cunningham because he has the career officer, which gives him leader experience gain, which is very useful. It just means he gets traits quicker and also upgrades his skills. And then he also has the green water expert. Submarines tend to really struggle in shallow water, so this can really help to mitigate and offset that penalty. Another thing you want to consider is submarines generally just want to do a lot of damage very, very quickly. So you might just want to select somebody who does a lot of damage. And that's why the Netherlands has the most deadly submarine commander in the entire game, Conrad Helfrich, because he starts with like a level 6 damage skill. It's potent. So John Cunningham is in charge of the submarine fleet, and then he has the different task forces. The way that you deploy task forces is by giving orders or missions, and that's what we have down here. So submarines almost exclusively use the convoy raiding. So if we just click on that, we can then right click on the different sea zones and they will be sent out to that. We have got 4 task forces, so generally I would recommend 1 sea zone per task force. For submarines, it doesn't matter as much. They will actually spread all of the submarines out over the different zones, and then depending on where a lot of action happens, the AI is actually pretty good about rerouting submarines to those areas where a lot of engagements are occurring. But this is a pretty good rule of the thumb. The other thing I would recommend is choosing how big your task forces are. Generally, for submarines, I'd go between 5 ships and 20. It really depends on how many submarines you're using and how flexible you want them to be. So here we are sailing through the North Sea, English Channel, Bay of Biscay, and Western Approaches, and we just unpause that real quick. We can see that we are hitting 100% efficiency. So then if we added another bunch, we can see that the efficiency goes down simply because we're asking our submarines to cover too big an area. So let's just go and limit it to these 3 zones. Before we go further talking about the other missions available, let's talk about how exactly these task forces function. And the different icons here, all of them looking a little bit scary. So first of all, let's talk about the automatic reinforcement, which is this button here. This is where you can tell your task force to get ships, replacement ships. So if you've lost submarines, and this is especially important for submarines because you will lose some throughout the game, this is saying, okay, we want a task force of 10 ships. And the way that you can control the composition of your fleets is through this, the composition editor. Here we can see that we have 10 submarines out of 10. We can change the maximum that we want with the plus and minus. We can also change the category, so you can assign different categories for different ships, and when we look at the recons, you will notice that I've actually assigned a bunch of the destroyers to the recon category specifically, so that only that type of submarine is assigned to that ship. And in fact, let's go and click on it right now so I can show you. So these 3 destroyers, I've identified the ABCD class as having very good surface detection and good submarine detection for their level. So I've given them in the fleet designer up here the recon role, and then I can assign only recon ships to this task force. So we have 2 light cruisers, 3 destroyers. Those destroyers are only of the spotter class. If you want to choose ships from any class, you can just use this star here. That's the wild card, and it will just say, okay, recons, yeah, whatever. Shields, sure. Gunners, sure. Whatever, doesn't matter. So that's a very useful ability to have. And then you can turn off or on the automatic reinforcements. Reinforcements are pulled from the reserve fleet, which is this one down at the bottom. That's always there. You can't get rid of it. And so we have these 8, actually we have 10 ships in the reserves right now. We have 1 aircraft carrier, 1 battle cruiser, 6 light cruisers, and then 2 submarines. So if we were to lose some submarines from the task forces here, then they would be drawn from these 2. Next up, we have the automatic split off. For submarines, you probably want to have this one on. So if a submarine is wounded, it will detach from the main task force and then return to a port and start repairing. This is really useful to do because it effectively allows you to just automate how your fleets are doing. You don't need to... You assign where you want them to be active, you assign who you want to be active within that task force, and then you just leave it. It's really quite nice. And then you can just keep an eye on your reserves to see if you're getting too many or too few, and you can also just see like the general strength. One cautionary thing though, if a group of ships gets damaged at the same time, they will split off as a group. So this is especially important for strike forces. They will have all 55 of these ships. If, say, both of these carriers were damaged, they would split off together. Even if one carrier was damaged to 99% and one to 1%, even though the 99 repairs quicker, it would stay in port with the 1% until the 1% is also repaired to the fullest. So that's just one slightly mitigating factor, which might be a caution against using automatic split off. But if you don't want to focus too much on your navies, you just kind of want to fire and forget, it's a great option to use. Next up, we have the repair priority. This is telling your fleets how badly damaged they are before they head to port. So never repair, they'll never go back. This is like fully manual. And I got to admit, I micro my strike fleets quite heavily, and I leave my strike fleets on never repair. Because what happens is when they get damaged, you get an icon over here on the side which replaces the upgrade and the just icon. And then you just click on it and they will sail back to the nearest port and start repairing, and then I just go through manually, because if you do it that way, they're not sailing back as a group and they will just repair individually, and once they are repaired, they will return to the fleet and active duty. So you can be low, medium, or high repair priority. So at high, it's like if they take a very little bit of damage, they'll sail back. Whereas if they're on low, they need to take quite bad damage, then they'll sail back. And then finally, we have the engagement orders. Ordinarily, you want to keep your fleets on medium risk. They will judge how strong the enemy fleet is and then decide whether they want to engage or not. You probably could get away with having strike fleets at high so that they can get involved in more sea battles if you want them to do that. Always engage is a bit dangerous because they'll be like, oh, there's 20 very well protected battleships and I'm just a light cruiser. We should totally go fight them. It's a bit of a dangerous one. And then do not engage. Do not engage actually has quite a few uses. For example, recon fleets. You probably want to set them to do not engage. They will just find the enemy fleet and then hang back at a distance, keep them in view while the strike fleet comes in. They're not actually built for combat. They don't have the numbers or the leadership for combat. So that is probably the best option for that. The low and high risk generally is just how risky they judge the situation, with the exception of submarines. Submarines actually function slightly differently. So if you set your submarines to engage at low risk only, they will only go after convoys. Even if they see the opportunity to try and sink a capital ship, they won't do it. Whereas if you set them to medium, if they see an unscreened capital ship, they'll take a couple of shots before retreating. So medium risk, if your opponent is using doom stacks, for example, this is a great way of just whittling them down. Just deploy a bunch of submarines there and just let them have a go. Because if they're doom stacking, their screening is almost certainly going to be terrible. So you have the opportunity. And then at high risk, they will actually engage enemy escorts. So if you notice that your opponent is not using any anti-submarine warfare, no depth charges at all, you might want to try this. Or if you just have so many submarines and you can afford to lose a couple and you just need to do some damage to their navy, as could happen late game as Germany trying to sink a bunch of British ships, or just damage them. Like, just damaging ships and making them go back for repair means they are not at sea, they are not acting against you, and that can be really quite precious. So at high risk, they will engage screens. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. Low risk, convoys only. Medium risk, they will attack capital ships if they see the opportunity. High risk, they will attack the screens as well. Okay, let's talk about the next type of task force. These are recon fleets. Recon fleets, their job is to patrol around the different sea zones. In fact, the order is called patrol, it's not called recon. And they will identify enemy fleets and then call in support. Now, this is one of the things I absolutely love about the Hearts of Iron system. You have a different interplay between the different orders. So the recon fleets are just sailing around, looking around for the enemy ships. They go, aha! Enemy capital ships spotted! And then they'll sit there and they'll just keep their eyes on it and they'll just watch it. And they'll go, hey, strike force, you probably want to come over and do it. Hey, strike force, hello? And they'll call in the strike forces who will then leave port and engage your opponent. So that's just one of those, I love the way that that works. So your recon fleets, you want to have them fairly small, you want to have them agile. One of their most important stats is speed. And, of course, you want to make sure that they've got great detection abilities. Surface detection to find surface ships and then sub-detection to find submarines. Light cruisers tend to do the surface detection the best because they have access to float planes, which are these guys. Float planes, as you can see, have that surface detection +7. They do slow the ship down a little bit, but that's fine. And then also sub detection. And then also radar, which unfortunately we haven't actually unlocked yet, so I can't show you. But float planes plus radar on a cruiser makes them godlike at finding enemy shipping. Destroyers are also decent. Destroyers can use just radar. And if you have the shipboard radar, that can really help. But they cannot get float planes. Only light cruisers and above. I think everything else can have them, except for submarines. Another thing which can be useful is to have recon ships just finding enemy convoys, and then have submarines on convoy interdiction, convoy raiding. So submarines aren't actually the best at detecting enemy shipping unless they have their own radar. So this can be useful. You want to have them quick, so if an enemy fleet goes, oh, there's recon over there, we should probably sink them, then your recons can just run away. So all of my recons, for example, have at least 27 nautical miles. Usually you actually want to aim for a 30 plus. So these destroyers being 35 knots are a lot more effective. I have a couple of newer cruisers which are 35 as well. So these two recons here are probably going to last a lot longer than these recons. Expect to lose a few. Enemies love shooting them, and they are great target practice. But they just serve such an invaluable role for summoning in the capital ships. So who should you assign as an admiral? Well, generally you want to have a spotter, because they're more likely to actually detect an enemy ship. You probably also want to have blockade runner. Blockade runner increases your retreat decision chance, so they're more likely to run away, and when they are running, they go faster. So blockade runner plus spotter would actually be the best combination. And you probably want to try and get a concealment expert for them, and probably destroyer leader and or cruiser captain. So there's a couple of different traits here, which will be great. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the future, but the recon admiral that I tend to use, I need to try and remember now, is... was it Forbes? Might have been Forbes. Tovey. Not Tovey. Tovey has a high chance of running away himself, which is Sorry, not running away, which is bad for recon. Somerville? Oh, it might actually be Somerville. Let's say it's Somerville. We'll put him in charge of the recon fleets. So, recon fleets, they have just detected an enemy fleet and they go, hey, capital ships, strike force, come and help us. So, let's talk about the strike fleets. The strike fleets are the heaviest arm of your force. These are where your capital ships are, this is where your carriers are, and it is definitely going to be the most numerous. For strike fleets, you want to have either an aviation enthusiast if you have a lot of carriers, or you want to have gunnery expert for Ironside if you have them. So Andrew Cunningham is probably one of the best admirals in the game because he is gunnery expert for Ironsides. He also has bold to increase naval speed so that the strike fleet is quicker at reacting to a call for help, and he does more damage. And he's also a career officer just for the extra leadership gain, so that's super nice. So Cunningham putting you in charge. So how exactly should you organize a strike fleet? Well, there is a golden rule for this, which is just as important as the combat width on land battles. So in combat width, you always want to have 10, 20, or 40 combat width. That's just like the golden rule for land war. At sea, you want to have at least 4 screens for every 1 capital ship. 4 screens. Always a minimum of 4 screens for 1 capital ship. So we can see here the first task force that we have, 2 carriers, 4 battleships, a battle cruiser, 4 heavy cruisers. That's 11 capital ships. All of those are 11 capital ships. And then 44 destroyers. If my maths is correct, 4 times 11 is 44. So this is a properly screened fleet. And this will be very, very effective in an engagement. The reason for this is there are effectively 3 different positions in a naval battle. In the front row are all the screens. If the screening efficiency is below 100%, then some of the damage which the screens would be taking would actually go to the second row. The second row where your capital ship sits, that's where the battleships, battle cruisers, heavy cruisers are. And then finally, if that row starts to falter a bit, then the damage will go to your carriers and your convoys. This is especially important for torpedoes because a torpedo can thread through a leaky screen and then start hitting the capital ships behind. It should be noted, however, that any heavy weapons can shoot over the front row. So battleships will shoot at enemy battleships while their secondaries or their light guns start shooting at the screens. So that's probably why you want to have a bit of a mix of different weaponry. But especially in terms of torpedoes, destroyers tend to have a lot of torpedoes equipped on them. If you have a leaky screen, then those torpedoes are going to start hitting your capital ships, and torpedoes do a ton of damage to the heavier ships. So you want to try and avoid that wherever possible. The other thing that I should mention with screening efficiency is your ships will arrive over time, and it takes them some time to get organized, particularly in larger fleets. So you want to have somebody with a good positioning skill. So the superior tactician on Andrew Cunningham is super helpful, and then fleet coordination and fleet positioning both also super good in terms of that. So initially you will have a couple of problems with screens, but the longer the battle goes on, the more cohesive the screener will become, depending of course on any losses. So actually in a fleet like this, you probably want to have about 50 destroyers, just so you have a bit of leeway. The other rule about this is carriers. You can have up to 4 carriers before they start to take penalties, and they take some pretty hefty penalties. The exception to that is if you have the base strike doctrine, then you can actually have 5 carriers. So in this instance, I have 2 carriers. I actually have 2 large strike fleets. So if it ever came to the situation where we needed to doom stack against the enemy, both of these strike fleets could be called in. That's 4 carriers. But that situation is quite rare. In fact, I would even argue that you probably want to have even smaller strike fleets because they will be called out to hunt down like enemy recon fleets or submarines they get detected, and that can be pretty fuel intensive. The reason that strike fleets are so important is because they sit in port if they're not called into action. And while they're sitting in port, they don't use fuel. Fuel is kind of precious. I mean, for the UK, you can buy it from America, but that's still civilian factories that you're using. For the US, it doesn't matter so much, but for like Germany, you want to keep your capital ships safely in Kiel as much as you possibly can because they're going to be so fuel intensive otherwise. So you only want them to sail out when they are summoned, and then they'll sail out because of the strike force or mission, and they'll fight at that point. So how exactly should you deploy recon fleets and strike forces? Well, recons work a little bit differently from the submarines in that you can only assign one recon fleet per sea zone. So we have got 8 recon fleets here, so we can effectively cover 8 different sea zones. And we actually set them to that. So we can see 0 of 8. If we unpause this, we can see that we have 2 recon fleets per zone at the moment because we've only covered 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that would now have a recon fleet in every single one of those, and if we did another one, we would find there's no recon fleet available for this. You can actually assign recon fleets specifically for a different zone. You just order it in the same way, but generally for recons I just say the whole fleet, and then it will automatically assign task forces depending on the sea zones you have selected, and they should fully cover that. If you hover over the area, you will notice that intel efficiency. That's how well screened or well reconnoitered each sea zone is. The bigger the sea zone, the more resources it will require. So for example, here in the English Channel, it's a pretty small sea zone. You're not going to need a lot of ships detecting enemy shipping there. Western approaches, you'll need a bit more. Then if you're out in like the Mid-Atlantic Gap or the Mid-Atlantic, you're going to require even more, particularly because it is a deep ocean and you have a much harder chance to find other ships. See, visibility minus 15%. Subs in particular are very effective in the deep oceans. There are a couple of ways of increasing your vision of enemy shipping. First of all, aeroplanes. If you assign in particular heavy fighters, of which we don't actually start with any, we'll just use fighters for now, and set them to the air superiority order, then they will get a bonus to detection anywhere within their radius. So it really depends on their mission efficiency. Heavy fighters do this even better. They actually have a higher weighting. So where possible, use heavy fighters instead of regular fighters for fleet detection. And then also tactical bombers and naval bombers. If they are doing naval strike in a region, then they will also be contributing detection. So we can see that aircraft detection total 5.6%. So that's additive to the regular detection. So we've got 100% intel efficiency here, but that's going to be a lot less further out. Then finally, radar will also increase your intel efficiency. The more radar that you have overlapping in one area, the effects are cumulative, so that would be better. Rather than just having one radar detecting, you want to have multiple, with multiple coverages over, for example, the North Sea or the English Channel, or wherever it is that you may be finding ships. This is especially true in the Mediterranean, where you can get an awful lot of overlapping radar, and you can constantly be detecting enemy ships and then sending out your strike forces and blowing them up, which is always good fun. Alright, let's go back to the strike force. Another thing I should point out is that a destroyer counts exactly the same as a light cruiser for screening, so don't think that you could say, I've got one cruiser, that's going to count for 4 destroyers. No, it doesn't. So if you want just pure screens, just get a bunch of very cheap destroyers, that's all you need, and then rely on your battleships and your carriers to actually do the damage itself. Alright, next up, we are going to talk about submarines, or rather how to counter them. I know that submarines are a big deal, particularly in the current multiplayer meta, where particularly players who don't like using navies or don't understand how the navies work will just spam out submarine after submarine after submarine after submarine. Or if you watched the Paradox game where I played as Greece and I just locked down the whole of Africa, that was because my opponents didn't really understand how to counter submarines. Well, there is one very easy solution to this, which is also why Greece did not suffer a single casualty to convoys from Bokun submarines from Australia, and that's because I had destroyers on the convoy escort order. And you can assign those just like any other order, and you will see this efficiency. The higher the efficiency, the more of the convoys they will actually protect. This is purely based on the number of destroyers you have in your fleet, so you probably want to have task forces of at least 20 destroyers, and they will protect all of this. So I have just 10 destroyers, building up to 20. As we get more in the reserve, they will automatically fill into this because automatic reinforcement is on. The way that this works is when a convoy detects a submarine or gets fired upon by submarines, they are then in distress. They will then put out a call for convoy escorts. Then depending on your convoy escort efficiency, your convoys will arrive. So destroyers should A, be very quick, because they'll be faster responding if they're very, very quick. And then also if you have escort efficiency, this is primarily gained through the doctrines. Fleet in being Escort efficiency is extremely high. Fleet and Being have great submarine warfare protection. Base strike, also pretty decent. Just a little bit shorter than Fleet and Being. Trade interdiction doesn't have any. So if you are planning on using convoys as trade interdiction and somebody else is using trade interdiction against you, prepare to lose a lot of convoys, because it's gonna be a lot more difficult to protect against them. You're gonna want to try to find overland routes or use synthetic refineries if it's an oil situation. Germany. So Fleet and Being is just super useful for that, just for the escort efficiency. So what exactly is escort efficiency? Well, this is a modifier on their speed to react to a threat. So when the convoy says, okay, I'm in danger, I need help, your destroyers then say, aha, okay, we're on our way. And then their reaction time is modified by the escort efficiency and their speed. So the higher the escort efficiency, the quicker they can jump in. And then, just like the screens in a regular battle, it works exactly the same way. The more the screening percentage, the less torpedoes get through. And this is a direct correlation. So if you have a 50% screening efficiency, 50% of the torpedoes will get through and hit you. 50% chance to hit. If you have a 70% screening efficiency, then it's a 30% chance to hit for the submarines. If you have a 100% screening efficiency, those torpedoes can't hit you. You are safe. So as long as you just have a bunch of destroyers, that can be very cheap destroyers, it doesn't matter if they're very good at actually detecting the submarines. You just want to brute force this and just have a wall of iron to stop the submarines firing upon your convoys. Of course, this is not cast iron. Submarines will still get a couple of shots off. It does take time for your ships to recover, to respond, especially early in the war, or if you're trade interdiction. So you probably will want to have some anti-submarine methods. But just as a straight-up protection, this is how you want to do it. You want to have as high escort efficiency as possible and very fast submarines. Don't equip them very much. Take off the torpedoes. Make sure they've just got a tiny little pop gun. Great big engine. They have sonar and what are they called? Depth charges, and that should be enough. I would then recommend that you create submarine hunter fleets. Submarine hunter fleets are basically destroyers souped up for submarine warfare, so give them extra depth charges, make sure they have the most up-to-date sonar, and then have them in small fleets of maybe 10 and strike forces. So make sure these are assigned to the areas where you know enemy submarines are and where you are less likely to come across enemy surface fleets, and they will go out as soon as submarines are detected. They will sail out and they will engage those submarines and try to sink them. Whereas a convoy escort will screen the convoys until they run away and then they will leave. They won't actually try to do damage. They'll fire, they'll have a go, but they're not going to be actively hunting the submarines, whereas a strike force with destroyers with anti-submarine warfare equipment is and will try to sink those subs. So that's just one thing to bear in mind when fighting against submarines. Just destroyers. Lots and lots of destroyers is the counter to submarines. It's actually a relatively simple counter. It's just that not a lot of people realize this, and not a lot of people focus on the doctrines. I mean, honestly, all you need to do if you have problems with this and you don't want to invest too much is just get these. These four. All four of these have escort efficiency, and at that point, just keep spamming out destroyers, and your anti-submarine will be fine. Probably. But Mordred, how exactly do naval battles work in this game? Well, using a little bit of console magic, I have made a war against Germany. I've turned off the AI so I could actually control the German fleets, and I've sent them into the English Channel, which was rather silly for them. So if we switch over to the naval map mode, we can see that we actually have a little bit more of an overview of the English Channel. We can see here that there is an enemy fleet present. We know that there are 4 capital ships and 20 screens. The less intel information you have, it will then be arranged. So it would say like 1 to 7 capital ships and like 4 to 40 screens. The other thing which is notable is this bar here. This is the progress bar. That fills over time as your recons basically narrow down and hone down upon your opponent. I had skipped a little bit of time, so that has already happened, but we've detected them. We now see that our strike fleet is sailing out and sailing to the sea zone, or the sea area region, where the enemy fleet is known to operate. And then boom, we have a battle. We can see the progress, or rather the victory chance. Blue is you, red is the enemy, and then the number of captured ships on your side, their side, screens on your side, and on their side. Then if we actually click on this icon here, we get the battle overview. First things first, we notice this screening efficiency, that is this golden shield. Our own screening efficiency is a little bit low, it's 91%, and that's because we have bad positioning. Because our fleet is just that big, it takes some time for this to tick up. Whereas the German fleet, being a lot smaller and commanded by Dönitz, who is very good at positioning, they've got into their positions a lot quicker. Positioning skill, let's see. Yeah, larger fleet, minus 43%. So just being this big compared to them has a penalty. So smaller strike forces, rather than what I've been using here, can actually be more effective, or using like the Hunter submarine packs that I was talking about earlier can also be effective. Next up, we've got the light guns. The light guns will be position 1 firing on position 1. This is screens versus screens, effectively. I can't remember if position 2 light guns can fire on position 1. They might be able to, but I don't think so. I think it's just position 1 to position 1. Then next up, we've got the heavy guns. These are position 2 to position 2, possibly position 2 to position 1. Not 100% sure on that one. So if anyone wants to clarify this in the comments, please do let me know. I'm putting my hand up and saying, I'm not 100% sure on this bit. Next up, we got the torpedoes. This is the sheer number of torpedoes that you've got active, and their accuracy, of course, is based on their screening efficiency. So even though we have a lot of torpedoes, thanks to the large number of destroyers we have, we're never going to hit anything because of how good their screening efficiency is. So if we can knock out a couple of their screens, then we can start targeting their capital ships with the torpedoes. Until that point, it's just going to be capital ships and planes versus capital ships. Next up, we have the fleet anti-air. So every round, aircraft will fly in, our AA shoots at them, and then any planes which get through the anti-air screen will drop their payloads and do some damage. Any planes which are here from a carrier as opposed to land-based will actually do a lot more damage. I think it's like a 500% modifier. So having carriers is really effective for that. But the damage that they do is then further mitigated by the AA. So the AA has a chance to damage the aircraft as they come in, and then also reduces the amount of damage done. And then finally we have the depth charges, which is your anti-submarine option, and then submarines will appear down here in the blue square. So unfortunately we don't have any active at the moment. There are two stances for submarines. There's the visible and invisible. If they're invisible, they just shoot. And they just keep on pinging away until they are detected, or they decide to run. If they are visible, then enemy depth charges can start to target them and start doing some damage. Possibly sinking them, probably sinking them. Subs are quite weak for that. However, one big change which they made with Man the Guns is once a fleet starts running away, they actually keep shooting. So as you're turning and running, you're shooting, which is extremely important for submarines fighting against convoys. Because even if an enemy escort arrives to protect the convoys and the subs are starting to run, they can still get some shots off, which is why that screening is so important. Because if they don't have enough destroyers to properly screen the convoys, then some of those torpedoes will still thread through and will still do the damage. So let's go ahead and unpause this. We will see some damage being done and possibly see some of them running away. So you notice now that we have got the arrows here. That's these guys trying to run. We've actually done some critical damage against the Admiral Shear, which is their heavy cruiser, and our own ships seem pretty much unaffected. Noteworthy, we have organization and strength just like on the land, except organization works slightly differently. The more organization you have, the less organization you have, the less damage you do. So if you are on 50% organization, you will do something like 50% less damage. I don't know the exact curve, if there is a curve, but this is why naval doctrines are important, because you want to get more organization so that your ships can stay in a battle for longer and lose less of their battlefield strength. Organization in this is more like ammunition than actual morale, although they obviously do have a chance to retreat, but I don't think that's related to organization. That's just how likely they think they are to win this battle. Also noteworthy, we have a bunch of reinforcements on the way. So this is the second and possibly even third strike fleets on the way in, because I just assigned all of them to the English Channel, and they've all gone, ooh, big battle, we should probably get involved. So you can see that other strike fleets will be called in from the area around, though they will be slower to respond. So let's just go ahead and unpause this. We can see the rest of our strike fleet has arrived. We've even got some submarines coming in to assist. They've still got a full screen, so not much that we can do against it. And our own screen is now really getting quite leaky, simply because there are so many ships present here compared to the enemy. So we are suffering a pretty hefty positioning penalty. Plus, because new ships are joining, it disrupts your organization even further, which means that you do take an even bigger positioning penalty, which converts into a screening penalty. But that will go down over time. And there we go. We are starting to sink their heavy ships. So this is my capital ships shooting over their heads, over the screens and doing some damage to them. Plus it's probably also the carrier aircraft targeting them because they don't have particularly good fleet anti-air. And now we're starting to sink a couple of the screens. This is probably just overwhelming numbers. Maybe also the cruisers. The cruisers tend to have more guns than destroyers do. And now we can see that our screening efficiency is going up as the positioning starts to increase. So as the organization gets better and better, we bring in more and more. And this is a very, very one-sided battle, and we sank basically everything there. 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, 10 destroyers for a cost of just 3 naval bombers from our carrier. Very, very good result for the British there. Also slightly one-sided because I totally stacked that against the Germans, but I think that does a pretty good job of showing you just how those naval battles work. I'm sorry that I don't know the exact mechanics behind positions, firing at positions. I have a pretty good idea. Generally, screen shoot at screens, capital shoot at capitals, carrier shoot at everything, submarines shoot at everything if they can, depending on the screening. Alright, so now that we've talked about the naval battles, let's go and discuss the admirals and how best to assign them. We did kind of go over this while talking about the various missions and the admirals that you want to have in them. But let's take a look at the traits very quickly here. There are different traits that you want to be taking into account. So for example, submarine admirals will want to get Seawolf. That increases the submarine attack simply by 20%, and that is done just by having a lot of submarines in the fleet. You then have a choice between Silent Hunter and Lancer. Silent Hunter means that your torpedoes are less likely to reveal you, so you start firing on the enemy, they don't know where you are. Or Lancer, which is screen penetration. So if their screen has a couple of holes in it, this makes it more likely that you will shoot through those holes. So particularly if you're using your submarines in an anti-capital ship role, Lancer can be good, and also if they just have very, very good escort efficiency, then, or lots of escorts, sorry, then Lancer could be really, really good. Then after that, you can actually get both Torpedo Expert, which is a torpedo hit chance, which actually works very nicely with Torpedo Reveal chance. If you have both of those, they kind of stack together. You shoot very accurately and you don't reveal yourself when you do shoot. Or Loading Drill Master, where you just shoot more torpedoes more quickly, which again kind of goes well with Lancer. You bust a hole in their lines and then you just exploit that gap. The other one which you may want to look to get is Concealment Expert, which just outright reduces your visibility. And honestly, I find that once you get this, your submarines are extremely difficult to detect, particularly if you equip your submarines with snorkels, which you can see right here. So snorkels will reduce the visibility even further, but there is a choice. You can either have radar or snorkels. So do you want your submarines to be harder to detect, which can be useful if you're in shallow waters, for example? So if you have submarines specifically operating in the English Channel, then you may want to give them snorkels, or if you have submarines which are out in the deep ocean, you probably want to give them radar so they can find those convoys and sink them more effectively. Okay, so we talked about the submarine officers. Let's talk about the capital ship officers. Most important for them is definitely Ironside, which will increase the amount of armor they give to their fleet. You can then get Big Guns Expert, which increases the capital ship attack. Marksman, which increases the chance to score critical hits. Safety First reduces the damage from crits, so especially if you have a bit of a leaky screen, then Safety First can be very effective to mitigate the damage done by torpedoes. Likewise with Crisis Magician, although Marksman and Crisis Magician are mutually exclusive. Ground Pounder is a naval invasion ability, This just reduces the number of guns that you require to get the maximum bonus. This does not increase the maximum bonus that you get from shore bombardment. So if you have ships sitting right on the shore, so imagine there's a battle going on in The Hague, for example, and you have capital ships parked in one of these two tiles, they will give a shore bombardment bonus in The Hague. That bonus is not increased by ground pounder or naval liaison, which is the general equivalent, but rather it requires less heavy guns. So if you have a lot of battleships, it's irrelevant. If you have just like 1 or 2 heavy cruisers, it might be useful, but honestly, it's very, very limited use. I'd much rather see that trait actually increase the amount of damage done by shore bombardment. And actually, this does lead us on to another point. There is actually another order here, which is naval invasion support. If you toggle this, then your ships will sail to whichever port you're using to launch a naval invasion from, and then when you launch it, your fleet will actually escort your armies tile per tile, so it means that they're much less likely to be intercepted by submarines and the like. And then any land battle going on in an adjacent province, so for example, if we just clear that, we set you to naval invasion support in the English Channel, any battles going on the Dutch coast, the Belgian coast, or the French northern French coast, they will provide a shore bombardment bonus too. I don't know exactly how that is done in regards to how many guns are from that battle, how many guns are in that battle. It does seem to spread them, but that can be really, really good. If you know you're fighting a lot of battles on the shore, stick a couple of ships on naval invasion support, and that can be really, really effective. Though, of course, bear in mind that enemy ships might also be trawling around in the area, and you may well need to consider that. Another thing which I've just noticed is we do have a couple of ships here which are damaged. So, whereas before I was talking about having the automatic split off to repair, this is how you would do it manually. So we've just sent all of these back home to repair, and then once they are repaired, they will join the fleet automatically. So that's really a nice thing to have. Then we also have mines and mine sweeping. So we have one cruiser here, which does have the mine laying kit, and with that you can assign them to be mine laying. Mines can do damage to ships sailing through that region, so if we plaster the English Channel with mines, enemy shipping that goes through there has a chance of being hit. I admit that chance is fairly low. You will not do a lot of damage with this. The real threat offered by mines is it will reduce the speed of all enemy ships in that area. So for example, if there are a bunch of submarines causing you mayhem and you mine it, then their submarines are going to move slower, meaning that your destroyers can react more quickly and sink them. Likewise, if you're being hit by a lot of surface raiders, so if Germany is using their battle cruisers to do hit and run surface raids, if you lay a bunch of mines, you're going to have a lot more chance to catch them. Or conversely, if you are Germany and you're using mines against the Royal Navy, they're going to have a much more difficult chance, or a much more difficult time to actually catch you. So if you mine everything around, say, the Eastern North Sea, then they are going to struggle to really control the Eastern North Sea because you'll just be able to hit and run pretty much at will. And the speed penalties offered by mine laying can be pretty potent. That was again one of the things. I mined the whole entirety of the Mediterranean during the Paradox multiplayer game, and that really stymied the effectiveness of enemy submarines in that area and really allowed me to counter that fairly easily. So yeah, not very often used. I admit I'm probably not the best example of using mines because that's the only time I ever really use them. But I do know how important they can be, particularly in those strategic instances where you want maneuverability and speed to really count against your opponent. So the final part of this tutorial is going to be talking about the doctrines. I'm not going to do this on a blow-by-blow account of what exactly each of these upgrades does, but rather just give you an overview of what to expect from the different branches. So starting with Fleet and Being, this is the most generalist option. They have really good escort efficiency abilities. Their surface fleets are excellent. They have by far the most powerful battleships in the game. Although, actually, trade interdiction doesn't fall that far behind in that. Their carriers, however, are awful. Fleet and Being carriers, not great. One exception is they actually can detect enemy submarines very effectively. These last two technologies increase the sub-detection of carriers, so it is possible that you could create small, fast carriers which are only there to bolster recon in anti-sub. I have not tried this, but theoretically that's possible. They also have decent submarine abilities. They're just really good all round. They are also the only ones that bolster mine-laying efficiency, as you can see down here. Next up, we've got Trade Interdiction. Trade Interdiction is all about hitting enemy convoy shipping. They have bonuses to submarines. In fact, all of this chain right here are the submarines, but also their surface fleets. They have bonuses for all ship classes, particularly... Nope, just... yeah, cruisers, battleships, and submarines have a very hefty convoy raiding bonus. This effectively reduces the number of ships that you require to cover a region, and therefore just have a high efficiency. Their surface fleets are pretty good at fighting. Not as good as the fleet in being, but decent. But the really big problem that Trade Interdiction has is they just have no escort efficiency whatsoever. So although they do have the ability to detect... oh no, they're 5%. I think that's literally it. Yep, 5%. So they struggle to protect their own convoys. Their main role is just hitting enemy convoys. But like I said, the surprise bonus is these two. This one, where they're light cruisers, heavy cruisers, battle cruisers, and then over here they're submarine battleships, are also really good at raiding. Next up, we've got Trade Interdiction, which are all about doing damage to enemy convoys. They have a lot of bonuses to convoy raiding for cruisers, battle cruisers, and battleships, so even their surface capital ships are good at raiding. Their carriers are decent, not on the same level as Base Strike, but definitely superior to Fleet and Being, and even their surface ships can probably go toe-to-toe with Fleet and Being. They certainly won't win it, but they have a lot of bonuses which are in common, for example, the capital ship armor here. So, Trade Interdiction, again, another generalist option. However, they really struggle in terms of protecting their own convoys. So whereas Fleet and Being has quite a few options to increase the escort efficiency, Trade Interdiction has a precisely 5% escort efficiency bonus. They are very, very bad at that. So if you're expecting to need to do a lot of overseas trade, then Trade Interdiction is probably not the choice for you. If, however, you want to really cause a lot of damage to enemy shipping and bring them to their knees, particularly like, I don't know, the UK or possibly even Japan, Trade Interdiction could certainly be your option there. Then finally we have Base Strike, which I will admit I have had the least experience with because I don't tend to use carriers, but they are by far and away the best carrier option. Their carriers are really quite obscene, getting more than double the organization of any other ship in any other category. So even the Fleet and Being battleships pale in comparison to the Base Strike carriers. They are incredible. The other thing which are extremely strong for Base Strike are light cruisers. Far more so than basically any other ship. So Base Strike, you just want to use light cruisers and carriers, which will actually result in extremely quick hit and run fleets that could do an awful lot of damage. They have a pretty good balance between Trade Interdiction, convoy raiding from their submarines, and then also the escort of their own convoys. So I quite like the balance from this. And then finally, they have kind of a hidden bonus where land-based naval bombers are more effective. So if you're not really planning on doing much at sea, and instead are going to be using land-based aircraft to counter enemy naval activity, Base Strike could well be the option for you. So for example, here we have plus 50% port strike efficiency. That's for everything. That's not just carrier aircraft. That's land-based too. And then also, I think they have another one somewhere, but I don't remember where. The final bonus for Base Strike is they can have an additional carrier in battle. So whereas the other two, Trade Interdiction, Fleet and Being, can have up to 4 carriers in a naval engagement before they start taking penalties, and that's regardless of the size of the carrier, by the way. It's just a straight up penalty per ship, and it's hefty. It's like 20% penalty per ship over. Base Striking can have up to 5 carriers in an engagement before they start suffering penalties. So there you go. If you like carriers, Base Strike. If you like using submarines and just sinking their shipping, or you just like using ships as hit and run, in Trade Interdiction. If you're trying to do anything else, Fleet and Being. And if you're worried about your own convoys being hit, Fleet and Being or Base Strike. Steer clear of Trade Interdiction. Anyway, I think that is going to be it from me for now. There are many other things I could talk about, for example, ship designs, but honestly, this was more about how to use the ships rather than to create them. Once you have a role in mind, you can usually design a ship to do that. So if you're trying to have really good escorts, then you'd probably be designing destroyers which are either very cheap or very good at anti-submarine warfare. If you're doing hit-and-run tactics, then you're going to be designing ships for speed, probably at a sacrifice of armor, whereas if you're just line of battle, trying to do as much damage slugging match, then you're going to be piling on the armor, piling on the guns. I would say that's rather more clear on a surface level, so you can make your own decisions within the ship designer, and it's a really cool system, by the way. I don't really want to like hash over just the opportunities you have in terms of equipping ships and choosing exactly how you want them built and coming up with your own designs. I mean, this is really cool, but it's a lot more self-apparent in exactly how that all works. Anyway, I do hope that this has been of use to you. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you want to get more information like this. I do play rather a lot of Hearts of Iron, particularly in Kaiserreich, so if you are interested in checking that out, or if you just want to see naval engagements actually done a lot, I tend to play very, very naval heavy countries like the UK, the Netherlands, the USA, Sweden, Greece, Italy, Japan. Then come along and say hi. You could usually find me on Twitch, which is twitch.tv/MordredViking, and it would be an absolute pleasure to see you there. Otherwise, we have Discord. If you have any questions for me personally, you can find that in the description below. It'd be great to see you there as well. New faces are always welcome. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. Do hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll catch you next time.